everyone. James here for ChessGoals. Recently we have published two courses, one on Nimzo Indian, one on the Queen's Indian. We're in production right now for a third course covering all of the sidelines. So anytime your opponent doesn't play 2c4. But additionally, in our Discord, we've had some questions around, well, how do I meet English? And for many years, the English was a particularly difficult opening for me to meet as well, because it's difficult to get those comfortable Queen's Indian-like positions, which kind of forces you to learn a bunch of additional theory if you want to get a playable position. So after c4, you can try and play what's called the Anglo-Indian defense, which goes something like knight f6, knight c3, e6, but here white can play the move e4, which is called the McKennis-Carles attack, and whether you play d5 or whether you play c5, white is doing quite well here and gets a small advantage in all variations, both sides playing accurately. So it's kind of hard to recommend this approach for black when white can pretty easily and with minimal effort get an opening advantage. This led me to look at sort of outside the box solutions, and what I'm going to present to you today is called the Owens defense, and I think with a little bit of theoretical work and a little bit of preparation, you can actually get very good positions that are very much in the spirit of the Queen's Indian and Nimzo Indian. So got a few games today. We'll go through them, and hopefully this will pique your curiosity to look into the Owens defense itself. So c4, and now b6. The idea of b6 is to get on the diagonal as quickly as possible. Now this is important against the English because a very popular move order in the English is actually c4, 1c4, and then 2b3. Getting on the long diagonal themselves, and that's aimed to prevent black from getting on the long diagonal. So we're immediately getting on the diagonal to ensure we will get that shadow. White continued with e4, and what we'll examine in this game is white's most ambitious setup, where they play a combination of knight c3, e4, d4, and c4, and that's considered to be quite threatening for black, at least theoretically speaking, but I really do believe with a little bit of familiarity, black gets very playable positions. Now, this is a slightly older game, and I played 2 bishop b7. I think that's not as accurate as 2 e6. The reason for that is if your opponent immediately plays d4 instead of knight c3, it's actually stronger to be able to play bishop b4 check right away. So just a small detail. So anyway, bishop b7, knight c3, e6. You're starting to see the contours of that Queen's Indian pawn structure. Now our opponent plays d4, so the most ambitious setup possible. We can play bishop b4, and so you see this combination of active bishops, very in the spirit of both the Queen's Indian and the Nimzo Indian. And with our last move, we're pinning this knight, which means that this e4 pawn is hanging. Now there's a variety of ways that white can defend. They can play f3, they can play bishop d3. These are the main moves. There are other tries here that would be covered in our upcoming course. My opponent played bishop d3, which is the best move. And now we see a common idea in this approach for black. Because we've not put a knight on f6, we can actually hit white with the very nice f5 move, getting in a very desirable pawn break and putting a lot of pressure on this e4 pawn. And note that white cannot take and white cannot push past because we will be able to take on g2 and then take the rook. And while taking on f5 does lead to some complications, this is covered in the upcoming course. Those complications favor black, so nothing to worry about here. So my opponent knew he needed to defend, and he played queen e2. I will say slightly more accurate is actually queen check first, g6, and then coming back to e2, just because that weakens some dark squares, pardon me, in black's camp, but queen e2 directly is certainly fine. I played knight f6, and at this point we have 1, 2, 3 attackers on the e4 square, and there are only 2 defenders. So white really should have played a move like f3. And after f3, we would play knight c6, attacking in the middle, bishop e3 to defend, and now e5, further increasing the pressure on this pawn. White normally responds with d5 here, and then black can actually sink the knight into white's camp with knight d4 right away. And obviously bishop takes, pawn takes. There's a problem with this knight here. This is a theoretical position. It's covered in the course. Quite comfortable for black, and black is sort of getting what they want out of the opening. But in the game after knight f6, and this really highlights how quickly things can go wrong for white, my opponent just played the natural move e5, but it's quite obvious that this wins at least some material for black. So I just went ahead and took on g2, and we'll be taking the rook on the next move. My opponent took on f6. This rook can't run away, so I just took back the pawn with my queen. And after my opponent played h4, trying to extricate the rook, giving it the h2 square, I picked up the rook as well. And at this point, 4 points of material ahead with a vastly better position. So white is lost as long as I don't make any mistakes. And I think this sort of miniature really shows how quickly white's position can fall apart, because black is going to place tremendous pressure on that center thanks to the f5 move. White tried bishop g5, but this is losing. The d4 pawn is of course hanging. So I took on d4, my opponent castled, I took on c3, and after he recaptured I took on c3 with check, winning even more material. We're now +6, and after the bishop blocked, bishop e4, just saving my bishop in the corner, preparing to take, and just mass liquidate pieces, at which point we've just got a winning endgame. My opponent tried a rook d2 to defend to avoid the queen trade, but this allows queen a1 check, and that will soon be checkmate. The only move is bishop b1, and then we can just take with the queen, and that will be checkmate. So a very quick and easy win for black in what is meant to be white's most dangerous try. And I think you'll get this about 1 in 10 games, so not a whole lot. What I think is actually more common in this position is you'll often get something like knight c3, e6, and then just d4, when after bishop b7, white really doesn't have anything better than going into some sort of Yunzo Indian or Queen's Indian, and that's probably about 1/3 of my games, with this more ambitious approach being maybe 1 in 10 games only. So I'll show you another game. And in this game, so c4, b6, knight c3, d6, the slightly more accurate move order, white can actually try and oppose you on the long diagonal. That's quite playable. So my opponent tried g3, bishop b7, e4. Knight f3 is more common, but e4 playing very ambitiously. And here I was able to play f5, and f5 really exploits this e4 pawn. It is pinned if their pawn was to take or to advance. We would just pick up the rook in the corner for free, so they must defend. Bishop g2 makes sense. Knight f6 now, further increasing the pressure on this pawn. If our opponent was to push forward, we'd get a result similar to the last game, except we'd pick up the bishop and then the rook, so completely winning. d3, defending this pawn. And here we can actually change strategies a little bit, and this is quite a common occurrence in the opening. We're going to strand the pawn on e4 after a series of exchanges. We'll even trade off the dark square bishops as well, like so. And then we'll push this pawn to e5, and what we're actually doing now is blockading this pawn on a light square, and we're going to try and put all of our pawns on dark squares in some combination. at which point in time we will have a pretty good bishop because there'll be targets stuck on light squares, and we'll have a very good knight. They'll have a fine knight, no problems with their knight, but a very poor bishop with multiple pawns stuck on light squares. And what we'd really like to achieve in the long run is to actually trade our bishop for their knight, getting a good knight, bad bishop ending, which probably will be winning for black. So we'll see how that went about achieving that. Knight e2, developing a piece. Both sides sort of just improving their pieces and setting up their material as strategically they should. Knight d7, the knight might come into c5 later. Queen e7, reinforcing my dark squares. It's very important that we maintain dark square control. And here my opponent actually went into knight d5, which I don't think is a very good move because it allows me to trade off my bishop. And certainly this bishop, my bishop is better than his bishop. My bishop is not restricted by its own pawns. It is attacking the pawn on e4, but at the same time, these pawns, possibly after the move f3, really do limit the activity of our bishop, so we're very happy to make this trade strategically. I think I made a slight inaccuracy here. I think just queen f7 was better than king h8, but I played king h8. My opponent played b4 to take away the c5 square, and at this point, black is just doing very well. We've got the better minor piece. We've got no real weaknesses, just one weakness here on c7, which is very hard to attack apart from the queen, but we can deal with one attacker. And just, rook on the semi-open file. We've got this pawn break here. So I started with knight f6, and that, firstly improves the knight with tempo, but after, I think, the very logical queen c6, we can just play, at some point, queen d7, force that queen trade, get rid of their only active piece, and then we're really in a two-outcome position. Either we'll grind them down in the ending, or it'll be a draw. And that's a fine result from black, so queen c6. Here I decided to play a5, and my idea was to double on the a file before taking on b4, and then try and dominate the a file, get some play that way. So a3, defending the pawn, a7, which defends c7 and prepares to double, f3, and now I doubled on the a file, and now I am just threatening to take on b4, because the a pawn would be pinned to the rook on a1. So my opponent responded by pushing another pawn onto a light square, so the pawn came to b5, and this also gives up the c5 square. So putting 1 and 1 together equals 2. I played queen d7 to achieve the queen trade. Queen takes, knight takes. Now the knight is coming to c5. Our rooks are a bit misplaced, but again, if we can just trade the rooks off, this knight is going to easily beat this bishop in the endgame. So my opponent tried rook fd1, a move I don't fully understand. Activated my first rook, putting another pawn on a light square, that just becomes a target later on. Improving my second rook. They're not doing anything on the a file, they're much better on the f file. King f2, it's an endgame, you should bring your king to the middle, so that makes sense. Knight c5, and now the knight's fantastic. It's got pressure here, pressure there. You could potentially jump into some of these squares in the future, so the knight's just absolutely excellent. This bishop, even if it were to be improved via h3, just has no targets because of this lovely dark square pawn chain. So black is much better here. King e3, g5, controlling the square, preventing that pawn break, and preparing a pathway for my king to the middle. Bishop h3, king g7, bishop f5. I guess the bishop is improved, but not for so long. h5 now. At some point, we will need to organize a pawn break. It's not necessarily obvious how we'll do that, but we're going to need to open a file in the future to trade the rooks off, at which point we can win with the knight. But if the rooks stay on, we probably won't have enough pressure to win this game. h3, king f6, just improving my king, bringing it closer to the middle. Perhaps my king will at some point, not with this bishop here, but maybe come to d7 and organize this pawn break with c6. So the king is much stronger in the middle. Rook f1, and I guess lining up with my king. knight b3. Here we have an opportunity to, via tempo, improve the knight and come to e5, where we might take this bishop and just win a pawn, go into a pawn up ending. It's good to have the option. Rook a b1, knight d4. We are threatening to take the bishop. My opponent tried g4, so my opponent didn't want to give up a pawn. Fair enough, but this now allows us to open the a file, and that means that the rooks are going to get traded. So at this point, black is strategically winning. So we open the a file, our opponent takes back. We can't win a pawn here, but we didn't really want to win a pawn. We really wanted to trade rooks. That was our strategic objective. So we just jump on that a file, our opponent challenges, and now we can just put the king on g7, and that's going to allow us to trade all the rooks on the a file. Our opponent tried bishop d7. I mean, what else? Rook takes, and now we put our rook on h8. And here my opponent resigned. Now my opponent's rated over 2,000 online play, so quite a strong player, top 5% of players online. And they recognise that this game is just lost. And the reason for that is if the rooks trade, white is unable to stop black from just playing knight b3, knight c5, knight takes a4. Winning a pawn, creating an outside pass pawn. So black would be completely winning in that position. If the rooks don't trade and the rook leaves the a file, then this rook can infiltrate either to h3 or h2. Then once the rook comes in, we should be able to pick up one of these pawns or this pawn here. There are just too many weaknesses. Black is too active, and this bishop is never going to be able to meaningfully participate in the game. So may seem like a premature capitulation, but black is completely winning here. And just, I think, a nice outcome from the opening. So realizing we had the opportunity very early on to, in this position, just play the move e5 and blockade this pawn. This is a common theme in the proposed repertoire I'll be proposing. Another game. So here, c4, b6, e4, again playing very ambitiously, e6. We're covering a lot of games with the move e4 because if white doesn't play with e4 early, you kind of just get a Nimzo-y, Queen's Indian-y type position, or even a full transposition to one of those openings, and that's going to be well within your comfort zone. So we really want to look at positions where white does play a little bit unusual, and doesn't allow us to get something that's very close to a Queen's Indian. So anyway, e6, knight c3, bishop e7, this all makes sense. And here my opponent played knight ge2, and this is a common setup. White is going to play d3 and rely on this, I guess, Botvinnik pawn wedge to really dominate the middle, control a lot of squares, and block out our bishop. And this is a setup that I've seen recommended in at least one Chessable course and at least one older book on the English. So my opponent probably knew a little bit about how to handle this position, and it can be quite a challenging setup if you don't have a clear idea of what to do. Now, I played knight f6, further attacking the e4 pawn and encouraging the move d3. e5 is not a threat. We're not concerned about that at all. You can actually just play knight into e4, start trading some pieces off. White's pawn structure becomes fixed and not flexible. Black can then get some desirable pawn breaks in the middle with d6 and c5. So not scary at all if they do that. So d3, by far the main move. And the idea I'm recommending here is actually to immediately break in the middle with d5. And this works because the knight on e2 is actually in the way of developing this bishop. So we both have two minor pieces developed, but this piece is going to have to be, knight on e2 is going to have to move again for white to finish their development. So black is actually ahead in development. White's development is quite awkward. If we give them enough time, they'll have great development and a great position. So we're going to strike immediately. cd5, e5, e5 is the main move. It's the best move. And then we play this counter punch d4. This is usually a pawn sacrifice, but black is playing very actively here and trying to exaggerate the lead in development. Now my opponent played e takes f6, which is not the best move. The best move in the titled player database. Like I said, this is a theoretical position. It's actually queen a4 check, when black can play queen d7 to block the check. And after white takes on d4 with a queen, black plays knight c6, developing another piece with an attack, forcing queen takes d7 and allowing knight f takes d7, which saves the knight from the e pawn. Now this pawn is under heavy pressure. The main way that people save it is by pushing d4 to protect e5, and then black has this move knight b4 with a very, very interesting position. So immediately threatening knight c2 check, which is very disruptive, and immediately able to play this c5 pawn break. And black is often castling long here to bring the rook to the middle as well, because to stop knight c2 check, white usually will play king to d1 or d2, and so after long castles, the rook is lined up with the king, and black has tremendous compensation for the lost pawn, but it's an interesting and slightly unclear position. So after d4, my opponent didn't play queen a4 check, they just played e takes f6, and this is kind of what you're hoping for. So they took our piece, we'll take their piece, and then he took another pawn, and I think this is just too greedy. More normal is for them to take back with a pawn, and then you can take with your queen. Material is even. They still need to move this knight again. The game goes on, and it's a relatively even position. My opponent took another pawn here. This is too greedy because now when we take back, our bishop comes on this long diagonal. It's already developed. We've got two monster bishops. My opponent took back with a pawn, and you'll notice now we have a very significant lead in development. Again, this knight will have to move again, but we have two fully developed pieces. Played knight c6. We're actually preparing long castles, so knight c6 very active. My opponent played d4. Okay. Queen e7, again preparing long castles, but also pinning this knight, which is going to make developing hard for our opponent. Bishop e3 unpinning. Now long castles, and so we've got the rook lined up with the queen. By my count, black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 developed pieces to really one developed piece, the bishop on e3. So for a single pawn, we have an absolutely enormous lead in development, and this is what you're trying to do by sacrificing this pawn. I think this position has been reached 4 times in the database with 3 wins for black. My opponent played the most common move, knight g3, and this allows a pretty nice knockout below. In a position like this, so much of a lead in development, to keep moving forward, you need to find a sacrifice. There's a pretty easy sacrifice here. We do just have knight takes d4, bearing in mind that this bishop is pinned, so c takes d4 only move. Now we can actually take with the rook. And this works again because the bishop can't take the rook, the bishop is pinned, so our opponent could give up their queen, but they wouldn't be able to capture back after we capture back with the bishop, so they'd be very down on material at that point. So they really can't capture with the queen, but there also isn't a good square to move the queen to. So I think objectively best is probably queen to b1, because black is also threatening queen b4 check, so this covers the check. But after a simple move like just doubling the rooks, and we might have a better move here, I don't know, I honestly haven't done a lot of analysis, but after just doubling the rooks, black is fully developed and white isn't. White also can't easily develop the light square bishop because we can take on g2. So I'm getting, not only getting a pawn, but really weakening the king even more. So I think a position like this is close to objectively lost for white. So yeah, I'm not sure what else they can really play, because they also need to cover this queen b4 check move, because if they don't, queen b4 check, the king can only come to e2, and you can throw in the bishop check, and you just have a very easy king hunt, and black's going to checkmate white very quickly. My opponent played knight f5, which just completely loses. I suppose, I'm attacking his queen, he's going to attack my queen, but we can just take your queen with check, and at this point my opponent resigned, even after taking back with the rook. we can just throw in like queen b4 check and then some other move with the bishop, and yeah, black is completely winning here, very easy. So you can get, as you can see, black gets these really strong attacks if white isn't extremely precise, and that's quite a fun way to play with the black pieces. And often, if your opponent is playing very precise, you're going to get these like solid positional type structures that, you know, we're a Nimzo Indian or Queen's Indian player. We like those solid positions. But if our opponent's going to play ambitiously and a little bit carelessly, you know, we'll happily get a very big attack. So another quick win for black. So the last game I wanted to show you, noting our opponent's rated over 2100, so a very strong player. So c4, b6, now knight f3, e6. So our opponent could at any point in time just play d4 and it's just a Queen's Indian. But our opponent played g3 here, bishop e7, again they could play d4 and it's a Queen's Indian. Bishop g2, knight f6, castles, bishop e7. So we're really trying to just offer them a transposition to a Queen's Indian. We'd love to get a Queen's Indian. But my opponent here played d3, and a lot of your opponents will play like this. They just refuse to transpose into the Queen's Indian. So they play these less ambitious moves. I've had e3 here as well, e3 or d3. And when your opponent plays like this, yes, they're avoiding the fury that comes with the Queen's Indian, but they're also playing more passively and less ambitiously. And so black just gets an even position without even having to try. White's not even fighting for an advantage. So there's nothing to be unhappy with here. Like, it's not going to be covered in any serious detail in the course because it's just a chess position. But your understanding of Queen's Indian structures will really help you. So I just castled, and my opponent played knight c3. I think this is not a great move. I think they needed to play something a little bit more active, but in any event, knight c3. And here I tried c5, really trying to take control of the d4 square, maybe intending to follow up with knight c6. The computer actually says the best way to play here is actually the immediate d5, or, you know, in the alternative, d6 and then c5. So, you know, I'm not perfect. I learned something as well. Anyway, c5, and our idea is knight c6. My opponent played e3, so another passive move. And again, this is very, very common. When they're avoiding going into a mainline Queen's Indian, you see these sort of passive moves. Nothing to be afraid of. And here we can just play d5. And at this point, black is a little bit better. We've got more pawns in the middle, and both of us have one undeveloped minor piece, with other development being even. So black's just a little bit better, and we really haven't had to do too much, and it's a move 8. So that's a great result. C takes d5. I played knight takes d5. I didn't want to get into our hanging pawn structure in the future, so knight takes d5 also ensures that our bishop stays open. Now, our opponent could try and pin us with a move like knight d2 or knight e5, but we can always bail out with knight takes c3 with an attack on the queen, and then that's going to let us trade light square bishops. So that's just an important resource to be aware of in the Queen's Indian. So d4, c takes d4, which is fine. The trading your d pawn for their c pawn and your c pawn for their d pawn is very, very common in the Nimzo and Queen's Indian. If you can do that, it's basically an even position. But here my opponent played knight takes d4, and what they're trying to do is pin our knight because of our undefended bishop. But as mentioned, we can bail out with knight takes c3, which, funnily enough, chess.com says brilliant move. It's a very run-of-the-mill move, very standard theme in the Queen's Indian, but, you know, thank you. I appreciate the exclam. B takes c3, bishop takes g2, king takes g2, and queen c7, attacking this pawn. And now's a good time to stop and think about how the position has transformed over the last few moves. Now this white king has some very weak squares around him, so he's a little bit more vulnerable. And we've got this weak pawn on the semi-open c file. So suddenly black's gone from slightly better to quite a bit better, thanks to the much safer king if you compare the two kings, but also the weakness on the c file. It's not a lot yet, but black is the one pressing for a win. And again, we've not really done too much. So opponent improved his position with queen b3. I played bishop f6, just putting pressure on this long diagonal. Computer's not a big fan, but I'm not perfect. Bishop a3, attacking our rook, improving the bishop, makes sense. Rook d8, coming on the open file. Rook fd1. Now here I played knight c6. Better was queen b7 check first, and then knight c6, so that knight b5 doesn't come with tempo, so that was a mistake. Knight c6, knight b5, now queen b7, lining up a discovered attack on that king, so the king steps back. Now we can play knight e5, and this check is actually quite scary. My opponent played knight d6, attacking our queen. Okay. Queen c6, putting another attacker on the knight. And here my opponent played e4. Yeah, which is fine, that works. Sorry, I was just trying to calculate. I now played bishop e7. I'm not sure why this gets an exclamation point. We're just attacking the piece for the third time. I suppose the knight can't retreat, right? Because we're controlling c4 twice. So, but it could just come to b5. Because even if you played bishop takes a3, there's knight takes a3. Yes. So, I don't know why chess.com is giving me an exclamation point here. Here my opponent played queen b5, so getting tricky. Because if I take queens, the knight can take back, and he's also threatening to take my knight. So, yeah, quite tricky. The problem with this is it does run into a puzzle rush tactic. We actually have rook takes d6, which removes the defender of the queen, but also defends my queen. So now queen takes queen, we save the rook. So queen takes e5 is forced, but now we have rook takes d1, which is a key in-between move, getting another trade in with the rook before it's captured. And at the end of all of this, the bishop on a3 was hanging. So we are just a piece up, and we need to convert. Now, my technique is not the best, but we did manage to get it home. So queen d4, bishop just bringing the bishop back. It's not on a good square. Queen e5, bishop f6, improving the bishop with tempo, and lining up an attack on this c3 pawn. So we'll grab that c3 pawn, thank you. He tried to go active with his rook, that's fine. Offering a rook trade, we don't mind giving up one pawn. We can trade rooks and also activate our rook. His king is going to be much weaker than ours. So my opponent did take the pawn. I played g6, just improving my king's safety. He tried rook c7 here. I played queen e5, and that's the downside of rook c7. It's a fork, so the exchange of queens is now forced, like so. And at this point, we've just got an overwhelming advantage. Equal pawns, but we're a full piece up, and we're going to be able to very quickly round up some more pawns as well. So my opponent went after my b pawn, I just defended. Went after his a pawn, which he can't stop, so we'll grab that. Taking some more space, preventing this king from coming into the position as so easily. Attacking my bishop, we can just support it with the b pawn. And now we're going to be able to go after these pawns, and the rook is just not going to be able to protect them, and we're going to increase our material advantage. It honestly may have been cleaner for me just to put the rook behind the passed pawn and push it up the board, but it's not what I did. So he went behind the passed pawn, and now we go after this pawn, which cannot be defended. Grab that pawn with check. King comes to here. We'll cover these squares with our king. This king is now at quite a lot of risk. Going to grab another pawn with check. So he defends. We put our bishop in a square where it's both defending the b pawn but also allowing us to capture this pawn. Grab that pawn with check. The king gets out of the mating net, which is a good thing. But at this point in time, we just played rook g4, and we're going to grab yet another pawn. And here my opponent resigned, because we're just going to be a million pawns up. We'll probably win both these pawns, and then just push these pawns to victory. So a very clean, very easy win in this game. No, we didn't really do anything too fancy. And this is the sort of game that you can expect when your opponent plays something that's like a Queen's Indian mainline but refuses to go into the Queen's Indian mainline with d4. You just play c5, play d5. You've got at least an even position, often a small advantage, and then you just see what happens from there. And it's a common theme in the Queen's Indian mainline. Once there's this exchange of bishops, the Resulting middle game, the computer will say is even, but there's always this issue with king safety. This king is always much weaker than the black king, and that can sometimes give black just a little bit more play in the middle game. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a taster of how, as a Queen's Indian player, I like to tackle the English. I really recommend this B6 system. And if you're interested in learning more about this B6 system, it's going to be covered in significant detail. I've got a lot of theory prepared for it in our upcoming third course in the Nimzo Indian and Queen's Indian openings. And you can expect to see a little bit more coverage on that on the upcoming No Pawn Intended podcast, and we will keep you updated if you're on our mailing list. So if you have any questions, please join our Discord and the community there, and I'm very happy to answer them. This has been James for ChessGoals. Thank you for watching.